Welcome to the debate. Today we're confronting a really fundamental question about how relationships can, well, unravel from within. We're drawing our insights from the compelling material, The Silent Erosion of Relationships. This text brilliantly outlines this sort of insidious path from unaddressed personal needs right through to outright contempt. Our central debate today is this. Does the primary responsibility for this silent erosion, this journey leading to contempt, lie predominantly with the individual who, repeatedly fails to set boundaries? Or does it emerge more profoundly from a kind of mutual failure within the broader relational dynamic? I'll be presenting the case for the primacy of individual responsibility in setting those crucial boundaries.
And I'll be exploring the argument for mutual responsibilities, inherent in that relational dynamic. That framing you've set up, it really cuts right to the heart of a crucial tension within this material. Because while I certainly acknowledge the profound destructiveness that stems from an individual's failure to assert themselves, I interpret the source material as revealing a more intricate mutual dynamic at play, not solely individual culpability.
Okay.
For example, just consider the breakdown of communication stage. The text explicitly tells us the partner making requests never hears no, so they assume everything is fine. Now, this isn't just about one person's silence. It highlights, I think, a reciprocal blind spot, where one partner's lack of assertion is met by the other's lack of deeper inquiry or perception. The true problem isn't solely the silent lie, as the text called it, but that this prevents honest conversations about needs, leaving one partner carrying the emotional labor. Now, that very idea of emotional labor being shouldered by one partner implies a relational imbalance, right? Where the other partner, perhaps by omission or lack of awareness, allows this burden to persist. The silent lie doesn't emerge in a vacuum. It's cultivated in a shared context, where both the active role-making request and the passive role silently agreeing contribute to its perpetuation. And, furthermore, the antidote of healthy boundaries isn't presented as just a unilateral act of self-assertion. It advises recognizing when to be flexible and when to hold the line, which really suggests a continuous, fluid negotiation between two people.
Right. I see the points about the shared context. And while I agree that relationships are inherently two-sided, the source material, to my mind, fundamentally centers on the individual's initial choice. The core idea it presents is that the quiet act of saying yes when you actually mean no plants the seeds of resentment stemming directly from a repeated failure to hold personal boundaries. This individual failure for me is the potent initial spark that ignites the entire destructive chain. It leads directly to what the text terms the automatic yes, the very first stage of breakdown. This is driven, as the text says, by an individual's ingrained habit, or there may be fear of conflict, where one partner agrees to things they don't truly want, perhaps consistently giving up their personal hobbies for shared activities, or always agreeing to social events they'd honestly rather skip. The document is quite clear on this. This act slowly removes authenticity from the relationship. And critically, all subsequent stages, the breakdown of communication, the growth of contempt, even emotional checkout, are presented as direct, logical consequences that unfold from this initial, personal decision not to assert one's needs. The source really emphasizes this internal origin, stating, the silent partner feels unappreciated, but blames their partner for demands they never pushed back on, And the prescribed antidote, healthy boundaries, is explicitly defined as self-preservation that prevents long-term resentment, reinforcing that the individual's agency in learning to say no, well, that's the foundational solution to halt this insidious erosion.
Your argument for individual accountability is certainly compelling. And look, I wouldn't dispute that the initial automatic yes is a critical starting point. However, I'm not entirely convinced that the erosion of the relationship itself remains solely the responsibility of that individual. Which brings us directly to our first point of contention, the origin of resentment and the often overlooked role of the other partner. Now, while the automatic yes is indeed an internal concession, right? A personal decision born of habit or fear of conflict, and it absolutely plants the seeds of resentment within that individual. The erosion of the relationship is, I would argue, profoundly amplified and, frankly, enabled by the other partner's lack of awareness during that subsequent breakdown of communication stage. The material is unambiguous here. The partner making requests never hears no, so they assume everything is fine.
Mm-hmm.
Now, is that assumption purely a reaction to the initial silence, or does it also speak to a relational blind spot, a kind of mutual failure to cultivate an environment where a no could be openly voiced and, importantly, safely received? For a silent lie to truly fester, it seems to me it requires both a teller and someone willing to accept the unspoken without perhaps probing deeper.
I understand why you see the other partner's assumption as a crucial factor, and I absolutely agree that healthy relationships thrive on mutual attentiveness. But my perspective, guided by the source, still holds that the automatic yes is the definitive starting point. It's an individual's internal choice. This personal decision to compromise one's own desires, to consistently yield on, say, personal time or specific preferences, that's what plants the seeds of resentment within that individual. This internal conflict is what directly precedes and fuels the subsequent relational breakdown stages, including that breakdown of communication and the growth of contempt. To my mind, the erosion fundamentally begins with one partner's uncommunicated internal conflict. The other partner's lack of awareness, while yes, regrettable, is more of a consequence, a reaction to a dynamic that has already been initiated by the silent lie. If there was no initial automatic yes, well, there would be no no to be missed in the first place, right? The responsibility for initiating that initial no or expressing the true feeling rests squarely with the individual.
You present a strong case for the primacy of that initial individual choice. But if that automatic yes is the genesis, it makes me wonder about the ripple effect. If it leads to one partner carrying a disproportionate burden, does that burden really remain solely individual, or does it transform into a shared relational challenge? Which brings us to our second key point, this idea of emotional labor as an individual versus a relational burden. Now, you might argue, and you have, that the fact of one partner carrying the emotional labor is a direct consequence of that initial automatic yes. The logic would follow that if the individual had asserted boundaries earlier, there'd be no silent lie, no hidden needs, and thus no disproportionate emotional burden. The responsibility for alleviating this burden, therefore, would rest with the individual to, use I statements and express their needs.
Exactly.
I would counter, however, that while an individual's failure to say no certainly leads to them taking on more emotional labor, the very concept of emotional labor inherently implies a dynamic where one person is consistently doing more than the other. This suggests, doesn't it, that the partner not carrying the emotional labor is either unaware, perhaps unwilling, or maybe just unequipped to share it. That relational imbalance where one partner's needs are consistently unvoiced and unmet while the other remains, oblivious, that strikes me as a mutual failing in the health of the relationship's communication, not just a solo act of self-neglect.
That's an interesting point about the inherent relational nature, or the label, of emotional labor. However, I frame it differently. From my perspective, the burden of emotional labor, while yes, it undeniably manifests relationally, is first and foremost a consequence of the individual's initial choice not to communicate their needs. Had the individual exercised their agency and clearly expressed their boundaries, perhaps through those I statements the text mentions, the silent lie would never take root, and the disproportionate emotional labor would simply not accumulate. The solution, as the source material consistently suggests, is active self-preservation through boundaries. Therefore, the responsibility for carrying, or maybe more importantly, alleviating this burden, predominantly rests with the individual to vocalize their needs and set those essential boundaries, rather than silently bearing a load they implicitly agreed to carry. This isn't to say the other partner is blameless in other areas, of course, but on this specific point of burden, it stems from the initial unvoiced yes.
I find it difficult to fully accept that line of reasoning, especially when we delve into the growth of contempt, which is our third significant point. The material states quite starkly that hidden frustrations build into disdain, and that the silent partner feels unappreciated but blames their partner for demands they never pushed back on. Now, you naturally emphasize that this growth of contempt largely originates from the silent partner's internalized resentment and their personal failure to communicate. The outward signs of contempt, the sarcasm, mockery, eye-rolling, are then seen as external manifestations of their unresolved internal conflict.
Right. They're symptoms.
Okay, symptoms, yes. While I agree that contempt may indeed originate from those hidden frustrations of the silent partner, its very expression, the sarcasm, the mockery, the eye-rolling, fundamentally transforms it into an interpersonal behavior that actively poisons the relationship. These are no longer silent internal feelings. They are direct, albeit deeply unhealthy, forms of communication that actively impact the other partner. How do you see those outward expressions as not being a truly mutual relational issue, but rather solely a symptom of that internal failure? The source's own definition of healthy boundaries explicitly highlights firm and kind communication and the use of I statements, which are, by their very nature, relational techniques. They're intended to manage conflict between partners. This strongly suggests, to me at least, that the expression and management of strong emotions, even those born of individual resentment, become a shared responsibility within the relationship.
I'm still not convinced that that line of reasoning shifts the locus of primary responsibility. While I absolutely concede that the expression of contempt clearly becomes an interpersonal act with harmful relational effects, no question there. The growth of that contempt, as the source material clearly outlines, stems from the silent partner's internalized resentment. It's their personal failure to communicate. The contempt is born from their hidden frustrations and their own blame for demands they never pushed back on. The outward behaviors you describe are, in my view, still fundamentally symptoms of an internal, unaddressed issue, an issue that could have been prevented had the individual initially established boundaries. The antidote emphasizes I statements precisely as a tool for the individual to assert their needs, thereby preventing the internal buildup that leads to contempt in the first place. So the relational techniques arguably come into play after the individual has failed to address their core needs effectively.
Mhm. Okay, let's consider our final point then, building trust and attraction, specifically in this relational context. The antidote section emphasizes that honesty strengthens trust, showing that when he says yes, he truly means it. Now, this directly links the individual act of honesty and boundary setting to the strengthening of trust. And furthermore, the material states that setting boundaries increases respect and attraction because a partner with clear boundaries signals self-worth, independence, and authenticity. This is, admittedly, a powerful argument for the individual's role in cultivating a more attractive and trustworthy self. However, and this is key from my perspective, while individual honesty is undeniably crucial, the act of strengthening trust is inherently relational, isn't it? Trust is built through a shared understanding and mutual respect, which necessitates an environment where a no can be voiced and genuinely heard and accepted by the other partner.
Okay.
The notion that people don't respect someone who always yields, that implies that the other partner's respect is conditional on the boundary setter's actions. Doesn't this highlight a dynamic where the response of the other partner to a boundary is absolutely crucial, and where both partners actively contribute to the conditions that either foster or erode trust and attraction? It feels much more like a reciprocal dance rather than a solo performance.
I understand the essential relational component of trust, and no one would argue it's a purely one-way street. However, the source material places such a strong emphasis on the individual's actions as the precursor, as the foundational step. It is the individual's honesty in their yes or no that strengthens trust. This honesty, stemming from clear boundaries, signals self-worth, independence, and authenticity, which in turn increases respect and attraction. The relational response, while undoubtedly important for sustaining this, seems secondary in the text framing to the individual's initial act of integrity. If one doesn't first establish clear boundaries to signal their self-worth and authenticity, well, the very foundation for genuine mutual respect and attraction is compromised, regardless of the other partner's potential receptivity. The individual has to take that critical first step in constructing the bedrock.
You know, our discussion today has truly illuminated the complex interplay within this idea of the silent erosion of relationships. While the dynamic nature of partnerships is undeniable, this material really presents a compelling case for the foundational and I still believe primary role of individual integrity in preventing relational breakdown. That seemingly small act of saying yes when you mean no is an individual's choice. It's an automatic yes that, to my mind, plants the initial insidious seeds of resentment. This individual decision then precipitates the entire destructive cycle, from the breakdown of communication all the way to emotional checkout. Therefore, the personal act of self-preservation through setting clear, kind boundaries really is the most critical defense against this erosion, as it fosters authenticity and prevents the silent, corrosive buildup of contempt within the individual.
And I think this conversation reinforces that while individual responsibility for setting boundaries is profoundly important and often the necessary first step, I'll grant you that, the silent erosion of relationships also reveals a significant and perhaps often overlooked mutual responsibility within the relational dynamic itself. That breakdown of communication, where one partner never hears no and consequently assumes everything is fine, points, I believe, to a collective failure, a failure to cultivate an environment of genuine openness. Both partners contribute actively or passively to the conditions under which the silent lie can fester and then escalate into destructive contempt. A truly resilient relationship, one that can withstand these erosive forces, seems to require not only that individuals assert their needs with courage, but also that both partners are deeply attuned to the potentially unvoiced needs of the other, actively creating space for that authentic expression.
Right. It seems this exchange really deepens our understanding that the pathway to lasting, loving partnerships involves addressing both the personal courage needed to choose honest communication over resentful peace, as the source puts it, and the mutual commitment to a relational dynamic where such honesty can actually flourish. It's like an internal seed requiring shared soil to truly grow. There's clearly much more to explore within this rich material.